ourselves of the very challenging reading with which we began the course. And I understand that. I have started you with a very rich kind of total cosmology of Southern African religions. And what I want to ask you is to remain resilient, because as we go through this course, we are going to populate that Chittister reading. And you are going to be so thankful that you were able to start with the big picture in order to put the more specific pieces that we'll have of Mbiti into there. Though it is hard. It is hard to give you such a tapestry to start with and then say, now the pieces are going to fit into place. But that's why I do it, and I think it's going to be helpful to you. So, really, the Chittister reading could be broken into 3 parts. The first part provides us a map of the 3 spheres of power, which he suggests we can think of as 3 religions at work. So he actually thinks these distinctive spheres of power, we might start to understand African traditional religion better if we actually thought of them as, wow, this is almost like 3 religions, and a person can participate and will participate at different moments at different times in all 3. So he concludes that first section on page 6. In an important sense, therefore, attention to power relations allows traditional African religion to appear as different spheres of interest that might even be regarded as 3 different religions. Those 3 African religions represented the different religious interests of the homestead heads, right? We've got that most intimate circle of power in which people move. Of chiefs, the larger tribal affiliation and regional power. And those specialists who exercised sacred knowledge and techniques in ways that were made available to both homestead and chiefdom. I might come in your house and we might do us a ritual to try and help alleviate somebody's suffering, but I also might appear at a chief's rainmaking ceremony because the sacred specialist has the capacity to offer skills to both of the other 2 areas. So the sacred specialist offers in ways that were made available to both the homestead and chiefdom, but belonged to neither, right? This is a 3rd orbiting sphere of power. Although all 3 spheres were conversant with similar symbols, they're going to talk the same language of ancestors. They're going to use, if the python's important to this community, you're going to use it in your homestead. You're going to use it in the chiefdom. The sacred specialist is going to have all kinds of knowledge about Python. So they're going to have a similar, they're conversant with similar symbols, myths, and rituals. These different domains of African religions, or different religions, each advanced different symbolic and material interests in the power relations of social life. So you have a pretty complex, but it's pretty useful, isn't it? The idea that there are actually 3 realms of power. We could think of them as 3 different religions. The second part of the Chittister article moves through the role of myth, ancestor rituals, symbolisms of evil, and sacred specialists. And each of those chapters is worth, each of those subheadings is worth its own attention. For instance, the difference between origin myths and those myths that seem to be performing that cultural work of making sense of what is happening now. So we've got a lot of good information in that second section. And then the third part explores the concentric circles of ritual practices, beginning with rites of passage in the homestead, and then moving out to rites of power. He concludes this third part. That is my phone quacking in the distance, and I can't answer it yet. He concludes this third part with an assessment of the ways that colonialism and capitalism unhinged and altered the two realms of ritual, the homestead and the chiefdom. And Chittister's concluding paragraph leads us well into Mbiti's discussion of African religions and philosophy, as Mbiti says, in all the complexities of both traditional and modern life. So Chittister's concluding paragraph to the article lays us squarely into this modern world where capitalism and colonialism have unhinged those traditional powers. So there's that final, and that once you have a migrating labor force, and once you have urbanization, you have a real unhinging of those traditional spheres of power. Linked with colonialism and capitalism, Christian missions were significant catalysts of change in Southern Africa. During the 19th century, so the 1800s, right? Southern Africa became one of the most missionized regions of the world. Here they come, right? And the communities had to adapt and respond to one of the largest missionizing movements in the whole world. Christian missions achieved little success, however, until the independent domain of the chiefdom and the homestead, along with the religious resources that supported those two spheres, became absorbed in a new colonial and capitalist order. So that's where we're at, and that's where we will pick up then with Mbiti. So in chapter 1, the introduction, he establishes how deeply religious practices and religious meanings are embedded in the daily life of Africans. He speaks of religions in the plural because they are located geographically and do not function as universal practices. But he uses philosophy in the singular because he is reflecting on the philosophical meanings that are implied but have not yet been developed into distinct schools of philosophical thought. He notes that Proverbs, however, when he's discussing philosophy, are a particularly rich source for such philosophical reflections. And this should signal to you that you want to look at all of his discussions of Proverbs very carefully. For example, when he writes that Proverbs, quote, deserve a separate treatment since their philosophical content is mainly situational, that's on page 2, he is opening a whole horizon of cultural study that is new to us in the States, and that we might miss otherwise. It's a bit like saying the use of judo moves is mainly situational. We can't understand either Proverbs or judo moves unless we understand the situation in which a master chooses and deploys a specific proverb like a specific kick. This tells us that proverbs are part of a serious strategy on the landscape of power relations among community members. These are not simply cute sayings, but rather have situational, strategic meaning, right? They're deployed, there are blocks, there are attacks. So there's no formal distinction, Mbiti tells us, between the sacred and the secular, and we shouldn't be surprised that animals are sacrificed at the World Cup, eh? We shouldn't be surprised that a regional chief will have a sacred specialist at his election headquarters. We shouldn't be surprised that planting crops might still entail offering beer to the ancestors. It's pretty hard everywhere to try and create these divisions between sacred and secular. That's why the approach we're taking in this class, thinking about people as orienteers, does not require us to have tidy boxes of separation. Rather, the things that hit one with regard to a sense of the ultimate significance of your place in the world will carry with them elements of the sacred. That's how the human works from a history of religions perspective. Now, Mbiti addresses modernity and acknowledges that when people are detached from their traditional environment through the processes of education, urbanization, and industrialization, then Africans, and I would add people of every culture, lose track of the conservative roots of traditional practices. Now, so modernity and technology have impacted traditional religions and at a global scale meant that fewer people have deep connections to landed practices. Mbiti argues that this is especially hard on Africans because they are left with a vacuum. Their religious sentiment and sensibility that was so deeply a part of their culture has little upon which to anchor life in the modern world. Now, he defines traditional religion as a dynamic force that has been seriously impacted due to colonization. And from this impact, he says, quote, traditional religions cannot remain intact. So we're not really studying intact or frozen old traditions. But they are by no means extinct. So he's letting us know that the modern study of traditional religions, they are not intact. And this is where Chittister would agree, right? Once homestead and chiefdom have been implicated into modernity and a capitalist system of employment, then we're looking at more of an unhinged, but by no means extinct religious world. We don't have dogma or texts, and he writes that traditions are handed down from the forebearers, quote, and each generation takes them up with modifications suitable to its own historical situation and needs, end quote. So this characterization works well with Chittister's argument regarding how we should hear the word tradition. It's not static and frozen, but rather strategically developing in dynamic cultures. Now, because traditional religions are not universal, that is, a universal religion is a kind of religion. They're either universal religions or indigenous religions. Universal religions make claims such as, Raven loves all people, and if you come to know the Raven, you too will become a Tutsi. Right? That would be a universalizing claim. But that's not how it works. These are indigenous religions. And that means they have no missionary drive. Because unless you were in that specific community and being impacted by its geographical power, for which you as an adult would need to learn the respect and manners of the region, then there's no reason to tell you about it. Mbiti acknowledges that the impacts of universal religion, and Chittister echoes this point as well, and globalization mean that some African traditions have taken on a global aspect, and their God now might be described in terms that sound like a universal God over all the earth. Now, Chittister has done some great work, for instance, on new African prophets who are pleased to use social networks to increase their audience. And so they're taking it out of Africa to the smorgasbord of contemporary spirituality. So they've kind of grabbed onto this universal religion gig, you might say. But the African traditional religions had no missionary outreach because there was no reason to bring somebody who is not kith, kin, buried, living here to this, because this is here. That's where it belongs. All right. There's not a redemptive future toward which one directs one's spiritual goals, but rather even the afterlife is understood in physical and material terms. The concentration is on the here and now, not the hereafter. Hence, our focus on time in Chapter 3. So, let's do time in its own whole little video. And thanks for listening.